Rechlin Winter 1944. In a windproof hangar, a captured P-47 lay still like a chained animal. The first panel popped off, no shiny inline engine, no salon aesthetics, just a rough R-2800 block. Thick pipes. Large quick-release locks, part numbers readable with gloves. Following the spine, they found the second heart, a rear-mounted turbo-supercharger, heat-resistant steel pipes running like factory pipes. At that moment, the German engineers froze the Americans designed to fly tomorrow, not to be displayed today. Their starting philosophy seemed immutable victory by ingenuity. In the test shop, the Germans worshipped clean surfaces, tight gaps, optimal density, pursued sleek aerodynamics, compact structures, hidden wiring like Swiss watches. Every detail had to be correct by the book, tight tolerances, precious materials, long machining hours. The aircraft were therefore beautiful, sharp, but unfavorable to mud weather and lack of spare parts. They despised the clumsiness of the Americans. Large screws, technical gaps, large printed part numbers, overburdened hangars, thick armor, wide landing gear. In their eyes, it was a waste, cheap engineering. A fighter they believed needed art, not chains. Early experience at the front reinforced their belief. The Bf-109 climbed well. The FW-190 turned sharply. Aesthetic turns were the truth. So when faced with an aircraft organized like a miniature factory, prioritizing repair replacement, continuous operation, and maintaining peak power, that pride begins to falter. At first glance, the captured American Weapon C looked like everything the Axis thought they understood and disdained about U.S. engineering. It was big. It was blunt. It wore a round engine like a steel mill's flywheel and dragged a forest of ducts and panels through the air. The Axis test pilots and engineers bred on the catechism of elegance, tight tolerances, trim cross-sections, jewel-like inline engines saw a caricature of excess. Weight, they said, is the original sin. And this American looked guilty from every angle. They laughed at the drag. The cowling wasn't knife-edged. The inlets were generous. Gaps around panels looked almost forgiving. Aerodynamicists with slide rules sharpened by years of marginal gains circled access doors the size of dinner trays and wrote parasitic in the margin. Aft in the fuselage, the turbo-supercharger and its stainless plumbing seemed a triumph of plumbing over purity, heat, shields, expansion, joints, intercooler cores, all heavy, all voluminous, all in their eyes aerodynamically indelicate. Too much airplane wrapped around an engine one could have quipped, and too much engine wrapped around a factory. Wing loading numbers on paper fed the smirk. A heavier machine means higher stall speeds, and in the Axis worldview, slower, lazier turns, especially down low, where most of their gun camera glory lived. In mock dogfights at modest altitudes, the lithe adversaries, those celebrated knife fighters, could scissor snap and pirouette with theatrical authority. The American refused to dance. It preferred to stride. And the Axis scored that as a demerit. They mocked the silhouette. Larger planform equals larger target. More metal to catch shrapnel. More outline for flak predictors to read. They pointed to the propeller with paddle blades crude, they said. A brute force answer. They tapped the armor plate behind the pilot. Wasteful mass, a confession you expect to be hit. They saw thick gauge mounts, wide track landing gear that looked agricultural compared to the elegant stocks they groomed at home. And they concluded the Americans lacked finesse. They questioned the climb. All that weight, all that drag, surely the ascent would be pedestrian. Early operational reports, taken out of context, seemed to agree. The American took time to spool its strength, preferring long vertical lanes to sprinters' steps. Axis pilots, intoxicated by initial rate of climb comparisons near their preferred altitude bands, filed away an easy story. We can go up past it and come down when we choose. They worried the fuel burn and then weaponized that worry into ridicule. A big radial gulping high octane seemed an emblem of American prodigality. In a besieged economy, fuel is blood. In a blockaded empire, it is oxygen. The Americans, the Axis said, had built a machine that only a petroleum giant could truly love. Even the maintenance picture seen from a distance gave them a reason to scoff. So many panels, so many hoses, so many unions and clamps, surely more to leak, more to loosen, more to chase when the machine aged. The aft-mounted turbo looked like a service nightmare, if you were thinking in boutique terms, hand-fitted one-off cleverness, the kind that flatters a master mechanic's pride but terrifies production managers. And then there was taste never written in a test report, always present in the room. The Axis aesthetic prized the kind of engineering that photographs beautifully symmetrical, installs sculpted ducts, thin-walled brilliance. By that standard, the American looked like a factory floor that learned to fly. It offended sensibilities honed by years of turning grams into meters per second squared. So they laughed at the mass. The drag, the size, the appetite, the plumbing. They laughed because on the ground, under white lights, and with a ruler in hand, the American looked like a compromise. What they missed was that it was a choice. And what they called inelegance was headroom. Strip away the paint. The pride, the showroom numbers, and the allied problem reveals itself in 3 verbs. Maintain, repair, move. Not once, not in peacetime, not in a lab, but everywhere. Every day in bad weather, under fire, at scale. The Allies didn't just need a superior fighter. They needed a machine that could survive the war's true environment. Mud strips, hurried turnarounds, rotating crews, long supply lines, mixed fuels, imperfect tools, and a schedule that answered to strategy, not sentiment. Maintain. A frontline fighter is a flying promise to be ready tomorrow. That means access panels you can open with cold hands, fittings you can reach without gymnastics, parts you can swap without re-rigging the whole airframe. It means fasteners and safety wire routed with the crew chief in mind, filters you can service on the line, magnetos, pumps, and governors designed as modules, not riddles. In this world, forgiving beats perfect. Tolerance is chosen to accept dust, vibration, thermal growth, and the occasional dropped washer matter more than lab-polished perfection. Documentation becomes hardware-stenciled arrows, clear placards, standardized torque values. The airplane must speak a common language to thousands of maintainers who will meet it tired, wet, and in the dark. Repair. Combat doesn't ask permission. It writes on metal with explosive grammar. To bring a battered aircraft back before the next sortie, you need armor in the right places, redundancy in the right systems, and structure that fails gracefully. You need skins that can be patched, hoses that accept new clamps, mounts that take a set and still carry load. You need engines that tolerate a chipped fin or a hot cylinder long enough to get home. And you need a supply chain that treats parts like water, plentiful, interchangeable, identically made, identically labeled. Interchangeability is not a nicety, it is a weapon. A spark plug that fits every engine of a type, a wheel that bolts to any leg, a gun that eats belts from any crate. These shave hours the way tactics shave miles. Move. War in multiple theaters is logistics wearing geography. Airframes must ship in crates. Assemblies must survive rail, truck, and ship. Tools must be ordinary. Jigs must be few. The airplane cannot be a museum piece that only thrives at the home field. It must be a traveler knockdown setup fly. Fuel types vary. Weather shifts. Runways are suggestions. Wide-track gear and big tires aren't ugly. They're passports to bad places. Corrosion protection, drain paths, and breathable structures aren't afterthoughts. They're visas for tropical heat and winter sleet. Scale ties the verbs together. It is one thing to maintain, repair, and move a squadron. It is another to do it for fleets across continents while the enemy targets depots, rails, and ports. The Allied air plan depended on tempo, sustained escort at altitude, on Monday interdiction at treetop height, on Tuesday emergency scramble at dawn on Wednesday. Tempo burns through man-hours, spare parts, and human patience. The only antidote is design that multiplies effort, standardized fasteners, repeatable procedures, line-replaceable units, and training curricula that turn farm boys into competent crew chiefs in weeks, not years. And over everything, altitude and distance. Strategic bombing demanded escorts that could climb into thin air and stay there. Tactical support demanded brutes that could descend into flak and live. One airframe that could do both by trading rotational energy and turbocharged lungs for brute survivability simplified the pipeline: fewer types, larger lots, cleaner supply. The airplane had to be not just fast, but available. Not just lethal, but resilient. Not just advanced, but adoptable by the average squadron today in rain with the wrong wrench. That was the untold problem. and elegance as a peacetime virtue was too small for it. The right answer would look at first like overkill, then under fire it would look like foresight. Every great war machine begins as an argument. Weapon C started as 3, make it modular, make it simple, make it reliable, then refuse to apologize for the weight that follows. The specification read like heresy in the salons of peacetime engineering design. Every line replaceable unit so a tired crew chief can swap it in minutes. Arrange systems so the human hand finds the fastener before the eye does. Accept drag in exchange for access. Pay up front in mass for the right to fly again tomorrow. The airframe skeleton was drawn not as sculpture, but as scaffolding. Bulkheads and longerons were sized with margin, then cross-braced, so localized damage wouldn't cascade into structural drama. Skin panels were large where it saved rivets, small and numerous, where access would be daily. Hinged doors, not dainty hatches, exposed entire systems, guns, radios, engine accessories, so maintainers could stand square to their work. If a panel needed a special tool, the design was wrong. If a line needed a shim, the routing was wrong. If a procedure required 2 experts, the procedure was wrong. Power was treated as a utility, not a jewel. The big radial in the nose was chosen because it forgave insult, debris, heat, even a cylinder gone sour, and kept turning. Behind it, the architects rejected a delicate, high-strung intake path, and instead built an industrial wind circuit intake, compression, cooling, and delivery as 4 declarative steps, each with room to live. Put the heat where the structure could take it. Put the intercooler where air flowed without begging. Put the turbo where vibration wouldn't shake it to pieces. Then stitch those volumes with hoses and ducts sized for tired hands, not museum tweezers. Standardization turned philosophy into logistics. Fasteners lived in a narrow family, so one wrench size solved half the airplane. Electrical connectors keyed only one way, labeled in stencil, big enough to read by moonlight. Hose clamps and safety wire ran in readable patterns so a junior could verify a senior's work at a glance. Filters slid out without a pilgrimage. Pumps, magnetos, and governors were boxes you pulled, not puzzles you decoded. The gun bays were not altarpieces. They were kitchens, clean open with belts feeding on broad, tolerant paths that didn't jam because someone sneezed. Simplicity did not mean primitive. It meant choices that privileged line rhythm over lab purity. If a component needed exotic metal to live, the requirement was suspect. If an aerodynamic gain demanded a contortion that doubled maintenance time, the gain was too expensive. If a sleek fairing hit a latch, the crew would need at 3 a.m. the fairing lost. Weapon C wore its purpose openly wide track legs for ugly strips armor, where bullets actually came from drain paths that respected rain and venting, that respected heat. Reliability finally was treated as a weapon class of its own. It was the authority behind tempo escort at altitude on Monday, rails and bridges at noon on Tuesday, scramble at dawn on Wednesday. Reliability lives in tolerance stacks and thermal clearances in routing that doesn't chafe in gaskets that accept being over-torqued and forgive being underloved. It lives in redundancy, 2 paths to spark 2 ways to keep fuel moving and control surfaces with enough trim authority to claw out of mistakes. The impossible idea wasn't speed alone or climb alone or even firepower alone. It was the assertion that an airplane could be engineered as a repeatable service fly-fix refuel return inside the chaos of continental war. That idea looks blunt under studio lights. It looks like foresight in freezing rain. They wheeled the captured Weapon C into a sealed hangar and began with the ritual of measurement weights, spans, gaps, angles, expecting the numbers to confirm their prejudice. Then the panels came off and the room's temperature changed. First shock, the engine bay wasn't a cathedral of polished inlets. It was a workshop that happened to spin a propeller. The big radial sat in a truss of steel tubes like a bridge, not a chalice. Accessory drives. Magnetos, pumps, the prop governor presented their fasteners plainly safety wire in neat, readable runs. Lines were over-braided where they would rub, clipped where they might wander, and routed with the laziness of experience, long, gentle bends that don't kink when the world vibrates. The Axis metallurgist pressed a fingernail to a weld bead on a bracket and found it stout, not showy, designed for a craftsman with a quota, not an artisan with a month. Second shock, the second heart lived aft. Peeling open the spine exposed stainless ducts the diameter of a man's forearm, a turbocharger on a cradle that allowed both heat growth and human error, and intercooler cores the size of small furniture. Expansion bellows gleamed where rigid tubes would have cracked. Drain bosses and inspection ports appeared exactly where a mechanic's patience usually died. It was plumbing, yes, but plumbing as doctrine. Hot exhaust ran to a turbine with room to breathe. Compressed air ran forward through cores that bled heat without starving flow. The intake manifold greeted that air with restraint rather than romance. The Axis aerodynamicists circled inlet lips that looked forgiving and realized that forgiveness was the point. Third shock everywhere. The hand expected a riddle. The airplane offered a handle. Gun bays opened like oven doors. Belts fed in smooth arcs, chutes broad enough to pardon a clumsy link. The electricians found looms bound in patterns that told a story, power here, signal there, each branch labeled in block text you could read with cold eyes. The radio rack slid on guides. The oxygen system wore clear guards where boots would wander. Even the cockpit admitted that pilots are human levers spaced for gloved fingers, placards, sharp critical switches gated against panic. Fourth shock, the landing gear looked agricultural and therefore inevitable. Wide-track fat tires, stout oleos, torque, links with bolts you could find in a crate. The Axis test team had mocked it from across the field. Up close, they saw why rough strips didn't scare it. The gear doors were not lace. They were lids easy to seal, easy to straighten, when the mud tried to keep a piece. Fifth shock, armor and structure obeyed experience, not sentiment. Plate behind the pilot. Heavy but bolted where patterns of battle said to bolt. Firewall and tank protection. Present without apology. Skins near the belly carried doubler patches that confessed a life of debris. Stringers there were just a size thicker than a stylist would allow. When the structural team traced load paths, they found generosity components sized to carry the day after a bad yesterday. Sixth shock, standardization whispered everywhere. The same fastener families repeated along the wings and the tail. Clamp sizes repeated across fuel oil and air. If you lost a screw in the gun bay, you could steal its twin from the radio tray. The Axis quartermaster in the room, usually an afterthought, suddenly sat forward. This machine was built for warehouses, for crates, for interchangeability that turns oceans into bridges. Finally, the flight notes bit. Up high, where thin air punishes the precious, the turbo's steady wind transformed the heavy airframe into a creature that did not tire. The test pilot wrote that at altitude the throttle felt like an honest contract. In the dive, controls grew firm but not mute. Recovery demanded respect but not prayer. Down low, the big props, crude paddles translated torque into authority, brutal on rails, decisive off target. What shocked the Axis wasn't a single miracle part. It was the absence of fragility. Every design choice muttered the same sentence: we expect abuse, and we will still be here tomorrow. That sentence multiplied across ducts, doors, brackets, looms, and legs was the secret sauce. It made speed useful, firepower repeatable, and distance survivable. And in a war decided by tempo, that is what superiority actually looks like. Rechlin Lertz. Airfield Winter 1944. Hard frost glazes the Mecklenburg Heath, and the captured American machine squats on the edge of a windswept dispersal. The Axis test program calls this Phase C field serviceability under adverse conditions. Unofficially, the ground crews call it the mud trial. Though mud today is armor soil frozen to brick ruts like cast iron rails. The order is simple and cruel: fly the airplane as a squadron would. Cold starts before dawn, multiple sorties, short turnarounds, improvised repairs, unpaved operations, and at least one extended climb to the thin blue. Then write what the machine says with its behavior, not its brochure. The cold soak begins at 03:10. The airplane has slept outdoors. Frost has crept into every seam. 2 crewmen arrive with lanterns and a canvas tool roll. A German Chief Schutz reads a checklist he wrote the night before. Eyes hooded, voice even. The cowling latches thump soft in the dark. The first panel comes off in a single swing so clean that Schutz stops reading just for a second. The Americans designed this door to expose not a peak, but a panorama oil tank cap, forward filler neck, accessible by glove. The primer hand pump sits where knuckles won't smash into brackets. Filters come free without a pilgrimage. A junior suggests warming the oil by brazier. Schutz shrugs and points to the drain boss and quick disconnect line. They purge the syrup mix, fresh stock, and refill without a single cursed angle. Magneto checks and master on. The priming procedure, so often a folk art on unfamiliar engines, reads like a grocery list on the placard. The starter growls, the prop heaves, the big radial coughs like a brewery waking, and then finds its rhythm. At 12 degrees C, engines love to quit. This one chooses to live. Oil pressure climbs in a civilized arc. The cowl flaps and intercooler doors answer without stiffness. The crew watches for the leak that always reveals an alien airplane's true nature. The floor stays dry. Taxi trial number 1, rutted perimeter track, frozen ridges, patches of iron-hard snow. The wide track gear that looked agricultural yesterday feels like design today. Where a narrow-legged thoroughbred would skip and threaten to bite, this machine plants. The pilot weaves to warm brakes and to learn the swing. The nose yaws with authority, not malice. Elevator down, to stick the tail throttle nudged, no drama. Visibility is what it is, a radial disc out front, but the taxiway's sins are answered by tires that refuse to trip. Dawn-grade takeoff from a rolled pasture. The test cards insist on a short field figure, gear down, abort, at 70 km out ports if the run looks sour. The pilot lines up on a chalked centerline, holds hard on brake and throttle, and releases. The paddle prop bites like a saw. The airplane surges over ragged ground, tail up, early rudder alive. The oleos swallow a frozen rut that would break a dainty fork. 40 seconds later, the gear leaps into its wells, doors shut with the finality of a safe, and the test conductor scratches a note he has never written for a foreign-type rough field takeoff routine. Climb 1 is controlled cruelty. Step to 8,000 meters and hold for 15 minutes. The aft-mounted turbo goes about its business with a lack of theater that unnerves the engineer assigned to hate it. Exhaust temperature marches within bracket. Boost steadies where ordered. Intercooler outlet temps hold in winter-thin air. The pilot's only complaint is the cold that leaks through his gloves, while the airplane herself refuses to be temperamental. The controls grow heavier with altitude but never sullen. When a stray ripple in the air trips compressibility, whispers the trim and the pilot's restraint are enough. On the down leg, the machine dives without wobble and recovers on schedule, no prayers, only muscle and plan. Turnaround 1, the stopwatch becomes a tyrant. Refuel, rearm, inspect, and launch again inside an hour. The gun bay doors drop open like kitchen ovens. Belts feed with the grace of gravity. The armorers exchange grins they intend to hide from the engineers. This is not art. This is work, and work goes faster when the space respects hands. A chafed clamp on an oil scavenge line is spotted by a junior because the routing is visible and forgiving. 3 minutes later, it's replaced with a part stolen shamelessly from a duplicate clamp family 2 panels over. No discussion about unique hardware, no scavenger hunt for a tool shaped like a priest's crook. The aircraft speaks a single dialect of fastener. Sortie 2 is low-level abuse. The scheduler demands a treetop run over a marked range, telegraph poles, and derelict rail cars, followed by a no-flaps landing on a rough lane to simulate a forward strip. The big prop churns icy air into authority. The heavy airplane that refuses to dance at exhibition altitudes becomes a razor at 3 meters off the deck, stable, predictive, immune to the porpoising that tempts narrower gear siblings to dig a wingtip. The 8 guns fired in a brief controlled squall shake the airframe but do not jam. On recovery, the pilot plants the ship on a lane that would humiliate a parade queen. The gear says yes. The oleos say yes. The brakes, warmed and reasonable, say yes. Rollout is a conversation, not an argument. By noon, wind veers and scaffolds snow into the open bays. Crew discipline usually collapses here. Tools disappear into drifts. Wrists stiffen. Fasteners fall and vanish. But the airplane keeps making the right shape of hole for human hands. Placards stay legible. Latches still swing. Doors close against their seals without coaxing. An access panel takes a minor bend after a sloppy set-down. The crew straightens it with a block and mallet and refits it in 5 minutes flat because the hinge line was designed to forgive a human's day. The third flight is the cruelty sprint simulated scramble. The pilot is told at 5 minutes that a strike package needs escort at 7,000 meters and that a low cell will foul the climb-out. Startup to airborne occurs on a calendar that breaks other types. The engine accepts being asked rudely. The turbo spools into the gap left by dense cloud. The airplane spears into overcast instruments, steady trim, predictable. When they punch into blue, the throttle feels like an honest lever order answer, no sulks. In between sorties, the Axis engineers start to sound like maintenance chiefs. The radio rack slides like a drawer. The oxygen plumbing is guarded where boots roam. Electrical looms run in readable paths, power on the left of the rib signal on the right, so a tired apprentice can trace a fault without a master's touch. Where other types hide their sins under finicky fairings that crack if you look wrong, this one leaves inspection open to the eye. You find problems early. You spend minutes, not afternoons. The day's last demand looks theatrical on paper and inevitable in war, a gear-up landing. The pilot lines up over a chalked rectangle. The field telephone squawks. The ground party clears. Props windmilling fuel secure the big belly greases along hard snow and stopped grass. Panels scuff, belly skins scrape. No wing digs. Fire never threatens. When they winch the airplane onto dolly jacks in the half-light, the damage reads like a receipt from a shop visit. Skins a few stringers, a fairing a pride or two. The engine has swallowed dust and offered no complaint. The turbo, the day's voodoo, is a little sooted and entirely unfazed. By 1740, the frost returns the logs close, and Schutz writes the only sentence he swore he would never write about a foreign type under his authority. We pushed for failure. The machine offered service. On the table, the stopwatch's face is fogged with breath. Beside it lies a pile of fasteners, everyone from the same family, everyone interchangeable. The crew packs tools that never once reached for a one-off shape. Phase C, the mud trial, ends with a photograph no one thinks to take, a heavy fighter resting on jacks, snow dusting its flanks, panels leaning against sawhorses, and 5 men, 2 pilots, 3 mechanics arguing quietly about whether the airplane is clever or merely honest. The argument is the compliment. In war, honesty is the highest cleverness. The report's last line for the day is unpoetic, which is why it rings true. Operational availability high. Work content per sortie low. Unknowns few. The test commander underlines few twice. Tomorrow they will fly the range trial and the degraded fuel card. Tonight they admit the thing that pride hates to say: the American didn't merely survive adversity at Rechlin Larts, it organized it. They did not surrender to a single number. Pride doesn't concede to a data point. It concedes to a pattern. The pattern formed like hoarfrost across the margins of reports: fewer red ink delays, fewer awaiting part entries, fewer cause undetermined squibs. It formed in the faces of the crews when a scramble order came and eyes didn't roll. It formed in what the pilots didn't say after flights: no long confessions, no the controls went dead, when no the engine sulked if. It formed in the fact that boredom threatened the engineers assigned to hate the airplane. When war makes you bored, it means something is working. The first admission belonged to Stein, the flight test lead whose handwriting could slice glass. In the debrief after the altitude card, he clicked his pencil twice, looked at the ceiling, and chose careful words. At height, he said, it maintains purpose. Pilots hear things in the tone that engineers miss. Purpose means the airplane keeps faith with inputs. It doesn't spring ambushes inside the airflow. Purpose means the stick grows heavy where you expect, not capriciously. The rudder bites when the ball drifts. The throttle delivers a promised manifold without the treachery of sudden heat or leak. Purpose is a vote of confidence that cannot be faked. The second admission came from a mechanic no one ever asked to speak. He had been conscripted into the turbo bay, a place that on other types breeds profanity. He held up a scrap of notepaper from the morning shift, a list of tools he'd used, each a common soldier spanner: safety wire, pliers, screwdriver, no idle, no one-off, priest's crook. He pointed at the big stainless duct and said with the purest kind of envy, "They made it for hands like mine. Not elegant, not lyrical. Indictment and admiration in 6 words. The third belonged to the quartermaster's deputy, a man who counted crates where others counted kills. He had noticed that the same clamps, bolts, and couplings appeared in different bays. He had noticed that a radio tray wouldn't put a squadron down because a tray from the next airframe would slide and lock and carry current without a shrug. He had noticed that the spare parts list looked like a poem written by a person who wanted to go home early but do the job right. He said, interchangeability breeds tempo. No one in the room knew they would repeat the phrase by habit before the week ended. The fourth came roaring out of a gun camera reel. The airplane had strafed a line of derelict wagons to test harmonization and to tempt a jam. The reels showed nothing poetic, just stable sight pictures and neat strikes. The armorers logged 0 stoppages. The belt path's great radius, which had offended sensibilities 3 days earlier, now looked like the geometry of sanity. "It doesn't fight us when we fight them," the armorer said. "Someone tried to improve on the line and failed. Perfect words can be accidental." The culmination was a meeting because institutions need ceremony when they reverse themselves. The chief engineer called his section heads into a gray room with a map on one wall and a clock that had been wrong for months. He placed the summary on the table and took off his glasses. The gesture mattered because he never did it. "Gentlemen," he began, "we must speak plainly." He then did the thing only brave bureaucrats can. He separated taste from truth. Taste said the airplane was a brute. Truth said brutes win if they run tomorrow. Taste said the plumbing was indecent. Truth said the plumbing produced altitude without the asthma that had haunted their own high-strung solutions. Taste said the landing gear looked like farm equipment. Truth said farms are where wars land when maps run out of runways. Taste said the cockpit placards were ugly, the switches guarded like industrial machinery. Truth said men who have slept 3 hours and flown 6 need safeguards more than they need prettiness. Taste said a radial is coarse. Truth said a radial brings people home with cylinders shot and feelings hurt. Taste said too many panels spoiled the line. Truth said those panels turned hours into minutes and downtime into sortie rates. Someone no one could later agree, who asked the only question that matters when pride fights, fact, is it the most effective and reliable weapon we have tested? The chief looked at his men the way a surgeon looks at a family in a hallway. "Yes," he said. The word fell like a wrench on concrete. No one flinched. The next words were softer and heavier. "It is effective because it is reliable. And it is reliable because it chooses service over style." There were still objections because objections are the immune system of engineering. The aerodynamicist insisted weight is a bill that comes due. The structures man countered, "That margin is a savings account. You withdraw under fire." The engine specialist grumbled that the turbo's grace was a winter gift. Would summer heat charm it so? The quartermaster answered with a ledger, even if it asks more fuel, it returns more missions. Even if it eats more crates, the crates are simpler. Even if it drinks, it does not steal because it repays you in availability. In a corner, the test pilot drew 2 axes on a blotter. Effectiveness on one, reliability on the other, and placed a dot far to the right and far above. "War favors this quadrant," he said. The chief nodded, and the argument ended not by decree but by geometry. Admission is not affection. No one in that room fell in love with the American shape, but they found themselves planning with it. If you can depend on a machine, you can write schedules with courage, pair it with bombers on Monday, turn it for rails on Tuesday, call it at dawn on Wednesday, to control a sky you do not own. You can afford aggressiveness because you can afford loss of time, not of aircraft. You can assign juniors to bays because the bays teach them. You can move squadrons the way you move freight because the crates don't lie. The last page of the formal report, cleared only after 3 rewrites, stated the realization, without poetry. Weapon C exhibits superior operational effectiveness, driven by superior operational reliability. Its design facilitates maintenance and repair at scale, enabling sustained tempo under austere conditions. The informal postscript copied in pencil into pocket notebooks because it felt like something to keep carried the human version. It does not break our day. It makes our day. There was a moment that would have embarrassed them had anyone filmed it. After a scrubbed 4th sortie, the crew chief closed the last panel and slapped it twice the way a farmer slaps a gate. The sound was domestic. The pilot helmet under his arm paused and ran a glove along the spine where the turbo slept. Unafraid, he said almost to himself. It wasn't praise exactly. It was an environment reading the airplane felt unafraid, and that feeling bled into the men around it. The engineer's men, trained to worship nuances, suddenly valued blunt virtues, availability, tolerance, forgiveness, repeatability. Words that never win beauty contests, but always win campaigns. The realization was not a thunderclap, but a change in weather. The air in the hangar no longer crackled with skepticism. It hummed with planning. The American had stopped being an exhibit. It had become a tool. Weeks later, when the paperwork had already hardened into conclusions, the chief engineer wrote a private letter to a friend at another station. He described the airplane without naming it, not because of secrecy, but because of humility. They chose to build a service, he wrote, not a sculpture. We mistook that for crudity. It is discipline. In war, discipline scales, and scale is the only magic left. He did not mail the letter. He folded it into the back of his notebook and went to the afternoon briefing. That evening, snow fell again on Rechlin Larts. The captured machine sat under its canvas, edged with frost, that traced every rivet. A mechanic walking home glanced at it and felt for the first time in months that tomorrow might be manageable. He did not adore the airplane. He trusted it. And trust, finally, is what made the Axis realization possible. The best weapon is the one that shows up, takes orders, forgives human error, and does it again under any sky. Wars are decided less by single brilliant strikes than by the ability to repeat them on schedule. Weapon C converted air power from a series of heroic episodes into a dependable service launch, strike, recover, turn, and launch again, under any sky. Once modularity and tolerance were engineered into every latch, duct, and bracket, tempo stopped, depending on luck. It became logistics you could hear in the rhythm of engines starting on time. Simplicity trained the workforce. Stenciled placards, standardized fasteners, and wide, forgiving belt paths meant a junior crewman could change a pump, clear a jam, re-rig a door first time in the dark with cold hands. Reliability emboldened air crews. Pilots flew higher and lower because controls stayed honest. The big engine forgave abuse, and the wide-track gear made bad fields survivable. Modularity lubricated supply. Depots shipped families of parts instead of bespoke unobtainium. Squadrons didn't cannibalize airframes because everything fit everything. Strategy distilled to calendars. Monday, high-altitude escort that preserves the bombers. Tuesday, rail interdiction that starves fuel and ammunition. Wednesday, at dawn, sweeps that deny the enemy a reset. The Axis flew when ready. The Allies flew by timetable. Over months, that difference hardened into numbers. Availability charts that stayed green, sortie curves that bent upward, bridges down longer than they were up. Most importantly, the design ethic traveled. Arctic cold starts Saharan heat, salt air, mud strips. The same fittings, tools, and checklists worked everywhere. Factories could plan lots. Schools could teach repeatable procedures. Depots could predict demand. Commanders could gamble knowing maintenance would pay the bill in minutes, not days. That is strategy wearing overalls. Simplicity and reliability were not the opposite of sophistication. They were sophistication aimed at availability. Availability creates tempo. Tempo creates pressure. Pressure collapses options. This is why the philosophy behind Weapon C did more than win dogfights. It shortened campaigns, and shortening campaigns is the only compassionate math in war. Official language hid the sting tables, tolerances, altitudes. The truth lived in the margins, quiet sentences engineers copied for themselves. We mistook mass for waste. It is reserve. We mistook large doors for crudity. They are speed. This aircraft is built for tired hands at poor fields. That is why it flies tomorrow. Senior Maintenance Officer Rechlin evaluation. A pilot who distrusted adjectives left one anyway. At height, it keeps its promises. At treetop, it does not betray its friends. If I must choose, I prefer it beside me rather than before me. Reliability is a kind of firepower. Flight test, lead altitude, and low-level trials. The quartermaster, a man of ledgers, translated feeling into logistics. Interchangeability breeds tempo. Fewer uniques faster turns steadier weeks. Deputy Supply Section. and the chief engineer arriving to confirm contempt, leaving with respect, summed the pivot without ornament. Effectiveness is begotten by reliability. Reliability is begotten by serviceable design. The American choice favors discipline over display. In sustained operations, only discipline scales. Section Chief Final Synthesis. No one learned to love the silhouette. Love is irrelevant. What mattered was the habit. The machine taught schedules written with confidence, scrambles answered without drama, repairs measured in minutes, not moods. Under that habit, Weapon C stopped being an exhibit and became a tool, blunt, forgiving, always present. History rarely quotes engineers. It records rails, cut bridges, fallen missions, flown. Read between those lines, and you can still hear the quiet confession the Axis professionals made at winter's edge. The best weapon is the one that shows up and keeps showing up until the other side runs out of days.